Hello, I'm John Magner.
I'm Jodi Majerus.
I'm Evan Cook.
And I'm Preston Valenza, and it is Sunday, December 15th, 2019, and we are interviewing Mrs. Jodi Majerus in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin.
Alright, so how did you end up in Milwaukee?
Okay. My mother and father lived in Sheboygan Falls, Wisconsin, and my father came home from the war, married my mother, had my brother in 1948. I was born in 49. My father worked at the Kohler Company at that time. That was the place to work if you lived in Sheboygan or Kohler. And he started a wildcat strike at the Kohler Company, and they were negotiating for several issues. One was arbitration, seniority, a wage increase, pension, a lunch period, and there were a few more issues that they were looking to get from the company. So after he was fired for organizing the strike, we moved to Milwaukee. We moved to Milwaukee when I was 4 and Rick was 5. We moved to a small duplex on 44th and North Avenue. Rick was old enough to go to kindergarten at that time, so every morning my mother would get us ready, and I remember vividly walking to the bus stop on Sherman Boulevard and North Avenue and heading south to go to Center Street and catching another bus and going to 51st Street and then walking Rick to St. Catherine's School. And then 2 hours later, we would have to come back and get him. So usually my mother would find some activity for her and I to do around the school because it really didn't pay to go back to the house because of the time it took to travel there. So my experiences at St. Catherine's is what you wanted to know?
Yeah.
I went to St. Catherine's from kindergarten through 8th grade. The classes were huge. It's really amazing that any of us could read. There were 70 kids in a class. And we were divided up into groups, and now in retrospect, they were divided up by where they felt we were placed according to our proficiency in what subject matter. And it was a typical Catholic school education at that time. Everything was very regimented. You walked in back of one another wherever you went somewhere, to the cafeteria, to the church, simply because they needed to have discipline and order when you have that many kids in a classroom. And some of the things that I vividly remember about the school was that we did, probably you did this too, we did fire drills where we would go outside in case there was a fire. We did tornado drills where we would go down into the basement in case there was a tornado. And then there was a drill that was called cover and duck. And that was for the nuclear bomb. And that was, I remember being terrified, even at a young age, of what does that mean, like the nuclear bomb. And so basically what they had a short cartoon about it where they showed a turtle. The turtle brought his head in, and then he was undercover. So they would have us duck down under our desk and then cover our heads in the event there was a bomb. The other thing that I remember about that is if they thought it was going to be a big bomb, and this is my recollection, keep in mind, as a primary student, is that we would walk over to the church basement, and we would be in our different classrooms, and then they would tell us that if there was a bomb, that they would have things for us to eat down there, like peanut butter and Tang. Do you know what Tang is?
Yeah.
Okay.
The orange.
Right. The astronauts took it into space, so they had peanut butter and Tang for us to eat in the event that there was, a bombing at the time. And I think I equate that to what I hear now from kids talking about active shooter. Now, that active shooter drill sounds scary. If there's an active shooter in your classroom, what do you do? To me, that's probably as terrifying for those kids as it was for me at that time. My mother volunteered to teach girls Phi Ed. My mother didn't have any background in teaching Phi Ed at all, and she would make up these exercises for the girls to do. And it was very funny. It was very funny. It was utter chaos. The school didn't have like an organized art class, a music class, or a gym class, and so she volunteered to teach gym, and she was awesome. She was a lot of fun, and the kids liked her, and we never really did a lot of hard exercise. And a couple other things I remember about grade school is that the Braves were in the series in 1957 and 58, and my dad brought in a television set for both Rick's and my classroom so that we could watch the Braves play. And so that was really cool. And we were the only class in the school who had that, and that was fun that he brought that in.
So, do you remember what kind of impact the Braves would have had on the city?
Oh, when the Braves won, the city was wild. I mean, everybody flooded down to Wisconsin Avenue, and like cars and honking, and people were just like riding on the tops of cars, and it was really a very, very exciting time for Milwaukee. Even the build-up to the Braves winning the series. There were people dancing in the streets. It was a big party, and I don't know if I can compare it to anything else in my lifetime where I saw like the streets just being full of people just out there just celebrating, open public drinking. And then they had a parade for the Brewers, an official parade. It wasn't the parade that night where everybody just ran out onto the street and partied.
So, what kind of, in grade school at St. Catherine's, what kind of sports or activities did you do?
Well, we really didn't have formal gym or sports. It was before Title IX, which is do you want to explain the Title IX? I do.
I mean, you probably have.
Okay. Well, it was really where the girls and the boys' athletics had to be equal, so we didn't have that. But we had our own little volleyball team where we would play the other grade. There's usually two classes, and there were 50 kids in a class, so there were at least 4 teams per class, and then we would rotate and play volleyball. We played baseball and on the playground, and the coaches for volleyball were the mothers, and the coaches for baseball were the fathers. Again, same for teams played, and we did not play other schools. We just typically stayed on St. Catherine's playground.
And then you were also in Girl Scouts in grade school, right?
Yes, I was in a Brownie and Girl Scouts. Brownie started in 2nd grade and I think go to 4th, and then you go to Girl Scouts, and then you work for merit badges on things you were interested in. It could be like animals or sewing or cooking. I never had very many badges. That wasn't my strong suit. But I did earn the Marion Award, which is the highest award in Catholic Girl Scouting. But for that, you had to put together like a scrapbook of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And I think everybody in our troop received the Marion Award because we all worked together.
And then, what about high school at Holy Angels? What kind of activities did you do there? How was that like?
Holy Angels was an all-girls school. It was located on 12th and Kilbourne. And so none of us had cars. Most of the families at that time, we were a middle-class family, had one car. And this gentleman who lived on the northwest side would bring him, he would be driving, his son, his daughter, and a friend from their neighborhood would come down to our neighborhood. We lived on 53rd off of North, and pick up Rick and myself, the 2 girls next door, and then we made another stop to pick up 2 other kids. And we were literally layered in the car. There weren't seatbelts at the time. So it was just like, the first row in, then the second row sat on those people's laps, and then you sat on those people's laps. And I think that the seatbelt was the person in front of you. And one thing that was interesting about it is that the car was huge, as I remember, is none of us smoked because the driver smoked a cigar, and in the winter he would always have the windows up, and everybody was choking. It was just like, and he said, "My car, my rules." And there we all were in this car that smelled like smoke, and none of us smoked after that. It was very, very funny. But at Holy Angels, I did a couple things that were kind of interesting. I was in an organization that was affiliated with Marquette High School, and it was called Marquette Organization of Racial Equality. And we went down to St. Francis School, and we would tutor the kids at St. Francis on Saturday morning to help bring them up to their proficiency level in reading and math. So I did that and played intramural volleyball, and I was in the chorus in the play. So that's pretty much what I did. And then the regular stuff that you do in high school is, get in cars, ride around, go to Gilly's Frozen Custard, go watch the boys play basketball or football. Always did that. And they had what they called Catholic Youth Organization, and that was basically for high school kids where they would have dances at the different parishes, and you would go to the dances. And then there was roller skating at St. Pius Grade School on Sunday afternoon, where you would go roller skating. So that was pretty much my high school activities that I can remember. I did some babysitting to work for money.
And then from that time, what do you remember about the suburbs of Milwaukee compared to how they're like today?
That's one thing that I don't have a good recollection of the suburbs. I have more of a recollection of the suburbs when my folks moved, during the 60s and the 70s, when they had like white blight, or the white people would move out to the suburbs because the black people were moving farther west. And that was one of my father's principles, is that if everybody leaves the city who has a job, there's no tax base to support the city. And we could never move because we don't move because somebody is of a different color of ourselves. And that's one of the things that he taught us from the time we were little, that everybody was created equal and everybody should be treated fairly and equal. In the late 60s, early 70s, I think it was late 60s, Father Groppi organized an open housing march because the housing was not fair in the city of Milwaukee. And so we would walk every night that he was home over the 16th Street Viaduct. And at times it got very contentious. It would be the commandos, which were the teenage boys who were supposed to provide safety for the marchers. Father Groppi led the march, and we would walk across the viaduct as the Polish people were walking towards us. They did not want black people on their side of town, and there was usually, some scuffles, and sometimes it was peaceful, sometimes it was not, sometimes there was just rock throwing, but we always walked across the bridge as a family, and that lasted for over 200 nights. And finally, the open housing bill was passed in Milwaukee. But that was one way that we were involved in the social justice program in Milwaukee. The other way was my mother and father always felt that we were lucky enough to have so much, and we would always go down to St. Ben's and help to feed the homeless people down there. I remember one Christmas, it was Christmas Eve was over, and we had so much food that my brother Rick and myself and some friends just packed up all food, and we had more coats and hats and gloves than we needed, and put them in a car and drove around downtown Milwaukee passing out warm clothes to the people who were homeless. And they were just so grateful. And it's very eye-opening if you start seeing people walking down the street and they have nothing, and you have so much.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, doing those kind of things and marching with Father Groppi, would like, well, first, like, what year was that, and then what did that feel like to you to do those things at that time?
I was in high school.
Okay.
And you felt like you needed to make change and to have people aware that people are equal and we can't base a judgment on people on the color of their skin. And that was something that my father talked to us about, and he always said to us, he quoted the Jewish sage Hillel, "If I am for myself alone, what good am I?" And so he always said that we needed to respect other people and to help other people. My dad marched with Martin Luther King across in Selma, and one of the things that was interesting that happened to him at the time is, and he was walking across the bridge, and a cop took him and picked him up by his collar and told him to curb it. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the term curb it. Curb it is you lay flat on the ground and you hold the curb with your hands. And if you move, you got hit with a baton. And it was difficult for my dad to get down and obviously to lay straight because it wasn't a comfortable position. And Rosie Greer was several rows in back of him. And my dad had no idea who it was, and Rosie Greer picked him up by his collar and said, "Man, you're walking with me. Nobody will touch you if you're with me." And he walked across the bridge with him.
So your father doing those things influenced you a lot in high school to march with Father Groppi?
Yeah, it influenced us in our whole lives and everything that we did, starting from the Kohler Strike and saying that, you know, what the working conditions in the plant were not fair, and that the company was making a lot of money and that they should share in that profit. And my dad was involved in a lot of social justice issues.
Okay, and then what was the climate in school between your classmates of people with different beliefs? Like, how was that in school?
The school was really not integrated. It was basically girls, and they're of middle class. So there wasn't a lot of tension because of the race relations that was going on. What affected, I think, the school more was when President Kennedy was shot. I think I was a sophomore, and they announced over the PA that the president had been shot, and there was just silence. You could not hear, nobody talked, nobody said anything. People started to cry, and they let us out of school, and everybody went home and then watched the TV that weekend as the events unwinded. As you know, he was the first Catholic president,
Yeah.
and he was one of a younger generation that also believed in social justice. My dad's influence on me was, and I can tell you, after he moved to Milwaukee, he was hired by the United Auto Workers, and at that time, the unions were huge, and they were powerful, and they had a lot of influence on who was elected. My dad rose through the ranks of the auto workers from being a representative, which meant that he took care of various local plants in town that were unionized, till he became the regional director for the United Auto Workers, and then rose to the second highest position in the union in Detroit, where he was the secretary-treasurer for the United Auto Workers. And he was a kingmaker. The man was a visionary, and he helped Jimmy Carter, John Kennedy get elected, and the night that Carter was elected president, he called our house to thank my dad for helping him. My dad also was involved in the McCullough hearings, which were investigating organized crime in the unions, with a target towards the Teamsters and Jimmy Hoffa. And he attended those hearings, which Robert Kennedy oversaw. And really the result of that was that they didn't find any corruption except for 20 people. I guess except for 20 people were placed in jail, and that out of that came the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act. So to try to, I guess, identify if there was any fraudulent reporting or corruption within the union.
So what was during that time of the civil rights and all that tension, what was the community in the city like, just the general community?
There was a lot of tension in the community with black and white. There's a curfew imposed where everyone had to be in the house. There were violence in the streets. There were, stones being thrown through windows. It was an angry time. It was an unjust time, and people were fighting for their rights. And it took a long time. And today I think we still have the problem. Milwaukee is one of the most segregated cities in the United States. And people basically stayed, if you wanted to be safe, you stayed in your part of town, is what it really amounted to. I also did, which was really interesting, is when I was in college, I did voter registration in the South, and that was to assure that all people who had the right to vote could vote. And during that time, the government was trying to prevent African Americans from voting, so they instituted some laws that they had to follow, like can they read, but it wasn't applied to both sides. And so that summer I went down there and did voter registration and tutoring in Greenville, Mississippi. And I lived in a convent with nuns, and it was dangerous because you'd be out every day trying to register people, take them to the courthouse, and ensure that they were able to vote. And if you know history, it was like after John Kennedy was killed, Lyndon Johnson signed into effect the voting registration law.
That was during your time in college. What else was your experience at Stevens Point like?
It was unremarkable. It was going to the bars, playing dorm volleyball, and studying as little as I had to.
And then the first Summerfest was when you were in college too, right?
Yes, it was in '71, I believe. And it was down by Henry Meyer Park. It wasn't like it was today. It wasn't structured. It was just bands playing on wooden stages, people stamping, dancing, a lot of drinking, there were a lot of drugs, and it was incredible. I'm trying to think. I think and the family Stone were there, but when things got to be rough, then around 11 o'clock, the friends that I was with left, but it turned into a big party, I guess. There wasn't any racial tension, it was just a big party. And it's nothing like it is today where the stages are built and it's clean and you were on the dirt and people just walking over the dirt and the dust was coming up, and it was just like the first big music festival.
So Summerfest kind of, would you say it unified the city more after the Civil Rights Movement?
I never thought about that. I mean, probably because they had, different bands that attracted different people. George Carlin was there one year, and I don't know if you're familiar with George Carlin, the comedian, that he said the 7 words that you cannot say publicly, and then he was arrested for that. And then the different bands. I don't know if it unified the city, but there wasn't any racial tension down there at the time that I was aware of.
Um, so, is there anything else you want to say about your college experience? And, like, were you in Milwaukee for some of that college experience, even when you were at Stevens Point? Or?
And I came home for, the summers. I always worked for the summer. I always worked in the summer. I worked at Niskara Playground as a playground coach one year. I worked at Master Lock in a factory for a couple years, and made good money. And I remember one of the things my dad said is, Rick worked at the brewery and I worked at Master Lock. He said that he never wanted to hear us tell anybody that we worked at a factory because we didn't know what it was like to work at a factory. We were there in the summers when I was in college. My freshman year, I went down to Greenwood, Mississippi. My sophomore year, I worked at Niskara Playground, which is over on 55th south of Washington Boulevard, and I was the girls' playground coach. So we did volleyball, we did baseball, and then we did little girl types of activities like hopscotch, dodgeball, foursquare. I did that for a year, and then my last 2 years I worked at Master Lock, and I had a menial job but was paid really well. And as I was saying, Rick worked at the brewery, and my dad was adamant that we don't tell people we've ever worked at a brewery or in the factory because it was 3 months out of our lives, and until we started putting in year after year after year into those kind of difficult, grinding jobs that were labor intensive, would we ever understand what it meant to work in a factory, and that we should be fortunate enough to work in the factory and get that kind of pay. And I remember him distinctly telling us that you have no idea what it's like to go into a place like that every day for 40 years. And that really had an impact on me too.
And then you grew up in Tosa, correct? Or like
No, I'm 53rd and Garfield, right off of North Avenue.
Okay, so but pretty close to Tosa, or not too far?
Right.
So were you involved at all in the Eagles Club protest in Wauwatosa?
The Eagles Club is on 26th in Wisconsin.
But like
So,
the protest
yes,
at the...
yes, it was all part of the Father Groppi open housing march. The Eagles Club was a men's club that some of the judges belonged to, and yes, we picketed the Eagles Club as well as the judges who belonged to the Eagles Club, to their homes. And naturally, the judges were not happy about that. They would much prefer that we had stayed at the Eagles Club, but we actually picketed their homes.
What was that like to experience that?
I think it was part of the whole big picture. It was like how civil rights needed to change in this country, that we can't discriminate against people because of color, race, or poverty level, that everybody was equal, and that no one should be excluded from living somewhere or belonging to a club because of the color of their skin or their gender.
And then you also mentioned you spent a lot of time in the Sherman Park area.
When I was younger, probably like in grade school, St. Catherine's was on 51st and Center, which is a lot closer than other places to go ice skating, and we went ice skating at Sherman Park a lot. When we first moved to Milwaukee, we lived on 57th and North Avenue, and then moved to 53rd Street. And Rick and I had started school at St. Catherine's, and being independent, and said that we didn't want to transfer to St. Sebastian's. St. Sebastian's was 2 blocks away from our house, but we wanted to finish at St. Catherine's because we had half of our grade school time in there. That's where our friends were, and that's where we wanted to finish. And my mother and father said, if you want to do that, then you have to understand you're going to have to walk to school and walk home from school, because they did not have 2 cars. And and that's what we did. So we stayed at St. Catherine's, and my sister, who was 9 years younger than I am, went to St. Sebastian's, went through St. Sebastian's. So my experience at Sherman Park was basically skating with friends from St. Catherine's, and there were a lot of kids from St. Catherine's that lived farther east like that than we did.
How have those areas like the Sherman Park area and kind of more of the inner city areas, how have those changed since then, would you say?
Well, my first job out of college was as a community organizer, and it was in the area around 27th and Valete Street, and they put up some housing there that was supposed to be affordable and decent housing. And what they found with the people that were living there is that a lot of the materials were inferior, that they put up drywall and they didn't paint the drywall, and it was coming apart and the water was coming through. And my job as a community organizer was to gather the people together around an issue and organize them so that they could protest what was happening in these, what were supposed to be affordable, decent housing for them, which wasn't. And that was an interesting experience. Went door to door and formed little neighborhood groups, and then brought the groups together so there would be larger groups, and put down the list of grievances that they had for their housing. And then we took them to the Department of City Development, and we had to build our case by taking pictures of what was going on in the housing. Also, there were a lot of gangs, and the older women were afraid to go out. And so they were looking for protection, more protection on the street, and they were also looking to have those buildings up to code, because they were no longer up to code. They weren't built to code, and they didn't stay up to code. And so we went down to the Department of City Development, and they presented their case, and things changed. And those buildings are still there today. I'm not sure what they look like inside now. But it was interesting that everybody was excited about this new housing that was going to be built. It was going to be, affordable. It was going to be good housing. There wouldn't be holes in the windows or anything like that. And it turned out really that because of the materials that were used, it was not up to code. They felt bad, and I felt bad for them. And also the fact that there were like a lot of the gang activities, and that the women were afraid to go out at night or afraid to go to the grocery store because they were going to be robbed. And that was it was a disappointment.
And then if you could elaborate on kind of your brother and what his involvement with his involvement in the city. Like, what do you remember about that?
His involvement in the city? Rick was a basketball junkie. Rick loved the game of basketball. He played for Al McGuire his freshman year, and he thought that he would play in his sophomore year, and Al came up to him and said, they called him Whitey at the time. His hair was white. And he played baseball, and he was good at baseball, but he loved basketball. And Al McGuire said, Whitey, he said, I'm going to cut you. You just don't have what it takes to play. And Rick did not accept that. He said, okay, okay. And so he coached. His first coaching job was at St. Sebastian's. He coached their 8th grade team. He was the assistant coach at Marquette High. And then he went back to Al, and Al brought him back on as an assistant coach. And he was tactically really, and I'm not saying this as a sister, he was tactically one of the most brilliant coaches in the country. He was just inaugurated or inducted into the National Collegiate Basketball Hall of Fame in November, which was really an experience. But Rick, well, as a family, we marched with Father Groppi before we had dinner. He was His involvement was more with the kids and taking them off the street and giving them something to do. So he would drive around the city and organize little basketball games and that.
So would you say that your brother was kind of influenced by your father as well in that way?
Absolutely. My father influenced our whole family, and he was very much involved in Rick's life and taught him the same thing that he taught all of us. I mean, when my dad was picketing at Kohler, he took us along on the picket line. I mean, we were singing Union songs before we were singing lullabies. And he, to impress upon us that we had a responsibility to make the country that we lived in better. And if we would not do it, who would do it?
And then, so how would you say Milwaukee compares to other cities that you've lived in or been to?
I will say that the Bucks did a phenomenal job of changing the downtown area right now. I mean, there are a lot of people who said, you know, they're just a bunch of out-of-towners from New York who are coming in, they're buying the Bucks, and then when they make money, they're going to leave. And they did a wonderful job. You know, the Pfizer Center is great. The Deer District is, incredible. There's new buildings going up down there. I think that it's spreading out, so you're going to see more housing in Brewer Hill that is better housing than what's there now. I think there's been a lot of changes, but the changes also have been that the Milwaukee had a huge manufacturing piece of the world, which is why they thought that if there was going to be a bombing, Milwaukee would be a site for the bombing when they had the satellite missiles placed around the city of Milwaukee, because of Alice Chalmers, Laddish, A.O. Smith. So as those jobs left, the poverty rate in Milwaukee shot up, and also the jobs for people who did not have further education were not available. So you had a lot of unemployment, you had a lot of people who turned to illegal activities to make money. But I think that what they're doing down in the Deer District is awesome. And I say kudos to the Bucks.
So you mentioned companies like Alice Chalmers and A.O. Smith. How else did those companies kind of affect the city?
They brought really good jobs to Milwaukee and well-paying jobs. They were union jobs. And life was good. The unemployment rate was low. People were making money. But as those jobs turned or were pulled offshore, the jobs went away and people couldn't make money anymore. And you saw like people doing 2 or 3 jobs, doing more service jobs, like working at McDonald's or working at Walmart, and not getting paid the same amount. And that was one thing that was interesting also while I was growing up. There was the whole economy of how you purchase goods has changed a lot since I was growing up. You had your corner store first, and then you'd go to your corner store and you'd buy your groceries, and then it got like you had your supermarkets like Kohl's, and then Kohl's grew, and there was a Kohl's like every 3 blocks, and then the corner stores closed. And now what we see today is with Amazon taking over, we see that there's a lot of bricks and mortar real estate that's not needed as much because your generation is online ordering most things. I mean, you can have groceries delivered in 2 hours. You can have your dinner delivered in an hour. And so that has a change on the economy and what type of jobs you have and what happens to all the bricks and mortar. So there's a huge change in just in the whole e-commerce. And as far as communication goes, you see some of the same changes. When I was growing up, there was a hard line to the house with a telephone. And first of all, there was the telephone, and it had a party line. Are you familiar with that? Where there'd be like multiple families sharing one line. You didn't know who they were, and you'd pick them up and you could hear them talking, and you didn't know who they were, but you wanted to use the phone. And so they hung up, then you could not use the phone. And then you got into a private line, and then that was just for your household. And then from there you got into communicating through faxes. Are you familiar with faxes? Okay. And then it went into like cell phones, and now we have smartphones. And the other thing that while I was growing up is it costs money to call out of your local district. Like if you wanted to call into Oshkosh, it was considered long distance, so that was a charge. Today you can call all over the world from your computer and it doesn't cost you anything. So just the way we communicate is different, the way we purchase our items are different, the whole structure is really, it's come a long way. When you look too at transportation, the city of Milwaukee had a trolley system, and now it's almost come full circle with that, what do they call that little train? The hop downtown, but it only takes like 3 miles. But the trolley system would take you from downtown out here. The bus system was really, a lot of people use the buses to get the transportation, and you don't see that anymore. Very few people use the buses, except, I think the millennials will change that. And the car industry, and that's what they're really concerned about, is what's going to happen to the car industry in the future. It's not going to be there. It's going to be 2 cars in every garage because of the footprint that it lays, the carbon footprint in the country. And it's like you can now ride share, you can buy a portion of a car, you can rent a car for a day, but you have to be in a city that has good mass transit, and Milwaukee doesn't have that. And that's something that Milwaukee should really look at. There should be some kind of, like, let's say call it light rail from Milwaukee to Waukesha, Milwaukee to Chicago. You see that, and that just isn't happening, or it's not happening as fast as it should. The hop is interesting, but it's not really moving people like you need to move people around the city.
So, like, along with the hop, how else has downtown in that area, like downtown, changed?
Well, downtown basically fell apart. They had the mall downtown, and they had stores in there, and that's coming back now, I think, again through the bucks and trying to put people downtown, the hotels that they're building downtown, the fact that they're bidding for conventions. The Democratic Convention will be here, and others, and they have more events at the arena, so you have to have a place to put these people. And so that's why you're seeing a lot of hotels going up. And also with the millennials, a lot of them don't want to buy a house. My generation, you bought your house, you lived there until your children were grown, and then maybe you moved, maybe you did not, but it became your family home. And what now you're seeing is a lot of people are renting. And in the downtown area, they're building apartment buildings more so than houses. And also apartment buildings are, your return on investment is much better because you're building up, you're not building horizontally. So you can get more units in that. So it's interesting of what your generation will be living, how you will be living, as opposed to how we live today with 2 and 3 cars. And do we need those? We don't share cars. Everybody has to have their own car. And also in the housing.
So, what else, like, in the downtown area, how did you, when you were growing up, like you mentioned the Pfizer Forum and that there's a lot of things going on downtown. When you were growing up, was it kind of the same way with, like, the mall and Gimbels and Schuster's and stuff?
There was. The arena was a big source of where entertainment came, and that's where Marquette played, and that was awesome. That was probably the best place that Marquette played, I think, because it held 10,000 people. It was always packed. The vibe was just awesome. The Warriors were a great team. And then we moved to the BMO, and that was not built for basketball, and that was terrible if you were down there. You know, you're really high up, you couldn't see the floor, it wasn't full, it was not conducive to playing basketball. And the Pfizer Center is, again, I think really a beautiful complex, and it, you know, I think it's a good draw. As far as like Gimbel's and Schuster's, we would go to Capitol. The Court was big when I was growing up, which was on the 60th and Capitol, more so than going downtown, just because it was quicker. I remember going downtown on my birthday with my grandmother. She would come. She lived in Appleton, and she would come down, and she would take each of us siblings on our birthday downtown, and we would get. We could skip school and have lunch downtown, and then pick out a present, and then take the bus back. But we didn't go downtown a lot.
So seeing kind of Milwaukee changed in such a way since then, would you say that you're proud to have been a Milwaukeean and kind of seen that change?
You know, that's a double-edged sword. You know, there's a lot of things about Milwaukee that don't make me proud. I mean, the fact that we're a segregated city, the fact that, you know, our public schools, our graduation rate is not good for public schools, that, you know, something should be done about that. The infrastructure, it seems like we're always under construction with the freeway, but it never quite gets done, and it's all torn up. So I don't know if proud is the right word. I think Milwaukee has the capability to be a good, you know, middle-sized city, but there's different decisions I would have made. Like Amazon wanted to go on the Capitol building down, you know, on Capitol, and then they moved to Oak Creek. Well, moving people to Oak Creek for jobs is difficult. Taking the bus from Milwaukee to Oak Creek is not easy. So when are we going to start, you know, either training people for the jobs of the future, and then how are we going to get the people? Like Foxconn, that's a long ways to go. And the jobs that they have there are going to be more high-tech jobs. So it's not going to do a lot for Milwaukee. So yes, there's been some good things that have happened, but there's a long way to go.
What do you remember about the Cold War and like the Nike missile in Milwaukee?
What I really remember was that, you know, cover and duck. You know, like go under your desk and cover your head. And you being older now, you're thinking, well, what would that have done really? I mean, and I think there was a lot of fear there, but they were afraid because I guess Milwaukee's manufacturing was so big for the country, and they really had like 6 missile sites strategically placed around the city of Milwaukee. One was on like 51st and Silver Spring. There was one in Cudahy, and I think that one's still there. And I don't know where the other ones were. I remember with my dad being active in the Kohler Strike, the radio frequency from Kohler did not reach Milwaukee, so he had to go to the outside of town, which was 51st and Silver Spring, at McGovern Park, and we used to play there I'm talking when we were like 6, 7, and 8, and then he would listen to the news that happened at the Kohler Strike at the time. But you could see the missiles, and they were terrifying, even though, you know, you didn't know what they meant, if they were active or they would be activated.
How do you remember Father Groppi's legacy on kind of the younger generation at that time?
Who are you defining as the younger generation?
Like, kind of, I guess, high school, grade school, college age.
I think that they were supportive of him. They knew that the way Milwaukee was treating a class of people was wrong. And then you had an older generation who didn't want black people in their area, and then they moved farther out. And then he had the commandos, which was like a group of young men who made sure there was peace and order. And some people thought that they were there to incite riots and violence, which wasn't the case. So I personally think he did a great job. I think he was very brave in organizing that. And there were, you know, probably like 200 people a night who would walk with him. So, you know, I think he should be congratulated, and he should be considered a hero of Milwaukee.
Earlier you mentioned working for the Department of City Development.
I worked for the community organization,
Okay.
and then we took our grievances to the Department of City Development.
Okay. So where else during your time in Milwaukee did you work after college?
I didn't. After I worked there, I ran Johnson Community Health Center. Johnson Community Health Center is on 13th and Wind Lake, which is like 13th and Lincoln, and it was a multidisciplinary health center. So they had social services, they had primary care, they had preventative care. Marquette Dental was in there, curative workshop for physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech therapy, and they had a vision center. And it was basically, they received funds from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to keep the building, to run the building, to support the building. And I was the director of that building. And that was an honor to be associated with that, because it provided care to people who didn't normally have an avenue to get care. And then from there, I was recruited to work for a health maintenance organization in Chicago, and it was run by a Catholic organization. And an HMO, or a health maintenance organization, is a way to deliver care. It's like you see a primary care doc first who organizes your care, and then if you need to see specialists like a orthopedic surgeon or an ENT, ears, nose, and throat doctor, or somebody for your pancreas, then he would give you a referral to see them, and he really managed your care and knew what was going on. And so my job for them was to negotiate contracts with hospitals and physician groups so that you would get a lower price than what they normally charge, because you would be bringing patients to them. So I worked for them for a couple years, and then I was recruited by Aetna out in Connecticut to do negotiations for them for large hospital chains. Across the country there are multiple chains like HCA or Tenant, and they're hospitals, and hospitals have, like everything else, they have a list price, and this is what they charge, and then there's a negotiated price. And depending upon how much power you had and how many members you could bring to them would depend upon your discount. And it was my job to negotiate so that our rates were lower, so that when employers would purchase it, that they would get a better deal. So I worked for Aetna, and then I was recruited to go to Aetna at the time merged with U.S. Healthcare. That was quite big, and they became Aetna, and I worked in India and Hong Kong during that transition. So I was in Hong Kong for about 4 months living, and then I was in India for about 3 months living, because we had contracts over in those countries. And that was interesting. And then Cigna recruited me, and I ran 2 programs for them. One program was their radiology program, and the radiology program included flat x-rays when you go to the doctor and you just have like a chest x-ray or your arm x-rays. And then there was a CT and an MRI. Have you had those? Mm-hmm. And so the amount of money that insurance companies spend on those is hundreds of thousands. So I was asked to develop a network of those across the country. So I did that for 2 years, And then the next job within that organization was to put together an implant, like implants, hip implants, knee implants, and put together a network for them for that at a reduced fee. And then I retired, and then I was called to do some consulting for different other companies, and here and there. And I do subbing at little Catholic schools now that I'm retired. And I enjoy that, but nothing too structured.
So since you started working in Milwaukee and till now, how have you seen the jobs and kind of industry in the city change?
Because I really didn't work here, I really was gone probably, like, I would say 42 weeks out of the year. I'd leave my house on Monday, come home on Thursday night. So I haven't really seen, like, the job market here change. I couldn't comment on that.
And then what about your brother and the Majerus Family Foundation? How's that impacted you?
Rick died in December of 2012. And when he died was the first I heard that he wanted a foundation. And so he had everything drawn up of how to fund the foundation and the 4 tenets of the foundation. And those are athletics, scholastic, your scholarship, medical research, and social justice. And so with that, I am president of the foundation. And then he was very prescriptive of, like, he wanted money because he made his money in St. Louis. He was there for 18 years. He wanted a certain money to go to St. Louis, to go to Salt Lake City, and he wanted it to go to the Huntsman Cancer Center. My mother had cancer, and she had 2 different types of cancer. She had breast cancer in 1988, and then she had small cell lung cancer in the year 2000. And most people with small cell lung cancer die within the year. The John Huntsman Cancer Institute made a concoction, or a cocktail as they call it, for chemotherapy, for her chemotherapy drug, and she lived for 11 years, which is absolutely remarkable. Everything was administered here, but the protocol was developed by the Huntsman Cancer Association, and obviously we're thankful for them for giving her to us for those 11 years that she would not have gotten. So he wanted something to go to the John Huntsman Cancer Foundation Institute, and some of the things that we've done, we contribute to St. Ben's for feeding the homeless. On Rick's birthday, my mom's birthday, and my dad's birthday, we feed the homeless, and we picked the birthday specifically because it was a day to celebrate their birthday in their life rather than their dying. And friends and neighbors, like Evan has been down there to serve, and we serve, like, their favorite meals. So Rick's birthday is February 17th, and we serve real chili. And we typically feed between 350 and 400 people. And then on my mother's birthday, we do a big brat fry. So there's all kinds of grills and the smoke. The whole downtown smells like bratwurst. And then on my dad's birthday, we just serve a roast beef dinner. We provided a gym for Thomas More. Thomas More came to us, Thomas More High School on the south side came to us and said, you know, they didn't have a floor left. There wasn't a floor left to sand. And they would not have a gym, and they asked us to put in a floor for them, and we put in a floor for them. We've supported adult literacy by providing computers for, now the state has changed the requirements. I'm trying to think back, like maybe in right around the time that Rick passed away, where they no longer could take adults could no longer take their GED on paper. They had to use computers, so they had to learn how to use computers. So we built a computer lab for them. And then for a grade school, we provided STEM classes and the materials for a small Catholic school. We have a Rick Majerus scholarship at Marquette High for kids from St. Sebastian's and St. Catherine's. And so we do things like that. So Rick was pretty prescriptive. However, a surprise was that he had that. He had thoughts on what he wanted. And I'll say it's difficult. It's very difficult. It's hard to lose a sibling, and then to be asked is an honor. To be asked to carry out the wishes of the sibling it's a special honor that I take seriously.
So, what else could you say about kind of your time since after college to retirement?
What else could I say about it?
Yeah, like your kind of work experience, I guess, where you worked in.
I think we went through that.
Okay.
Was that anything that? Are you talking about like
Anything else
yeah?
that you wanted to
Well, you know, I did traveling. I love to travel. I was lucky enough to take a tour on the Yangtze River in China before it was dammed. I saw the pyramids in Egypt. I have been to most countries in Europe. We took my mother for her 70th birthday. All the girls in the family, my sister, and she has 2 daughters, took her to England. And that was just a gas taking my mom there. So I like to travel. I have done some canoe trips that were not as successful as they should be up in Alaska. And also in Colorado. And that was fun, even though we almost lost one of the people. And I've done fly fishing, and that was kind of fun. So just different things like that. Now, since I've retired, I've gotten into Mahjong, which is a tile game that the Chinese play and the Jewish organization. I'm on the board of HERC. Are you familiar with them? It's the Holocaust Education Resource Center. And their mission is do not forget what happened at the Holocaust. And I've gotten to meet survivors of the Holocaust and talk to them and put together materials for teachers of how to teach about the Holocaust. The state of Wisconsin does not mandate teaching the Holocaust as part of World War II history. And it's uncomfortable for people to teach that. It's not it's an uncomfortable topic, and people don't know how to teach it, and so they lightly go over it, and it needs to be brought in. Right now, I'm working with a group from HERC to put a bill in front of the legislature that would mandate the teaching of the Holocaust in high school, and that's been very rewarding. And as you know, the anti-Semitic activities, you see more now than you have, I think, probably in your lifetime. It's definitely in my lifetime. And why is that? I'm not sure.
So, having kind of seen the civil rights movement and then the collapse of the industry in Milwaukee, what would you like to see Milwaukee progress, or what kind of vision do you have for Milwaukee in the future?
That's really a good question. I really don't know if I have the knowledge to. I would say this: I think our whole education system in Milwaukee needs to change. Kids aren't staying in school and they're not graduating. I think that the MATC is a jewel in this community that people don't really realize the things that they can do. Not everybody has to go to college, but the MATC offers different types of classes. Like you can go there for 2 years and then move on to a 4-year college for nursing, and you're not going to end up with the same amount of debt. They have a wonderful culinary school. They have a robotics class that's just wonderful in preparing people for more high-tech jobs. So I think that people should really look at that. And what you hear from a lot of people are parents want their kids to go to college, but if you don't know what you want to do in college, why are you going to college? You know, and I think that, and it's hard to know what you want. Not everybody knows when they're a freshman what they want. But there are other things besides college that you could do. So I guess if I had a priority, I would look at the education system in Milwaukee.
So you think the education system has gotten better or worse since you were in grade school or high school?
I would say it's probably the same.
All right, well, I guess that's all we have for you. So thank you again for coming and giving the time. And
I don't know if that helped.
Oh, no.
That was great stuff, very interesting.
Yeah. There's a quote from Rick that I'd like to end with, if you would want to put that back on, that I think it's fitting for where I am in my life, and I think it's just something that is struck me. That's I'm going to I'll sum it up for you. Rick is probably really one of the smartest men I know, and most people think about him as just being a phenomenal basketball player, but he was more than that. He was just smart about many things, and he had a lot of intellectual curiosity. And one of the things he said about life is that life is to be enjoyed and to be cherished and shared. And I've tried to do that. I think I understand what's important. It's not the trappings or the lendings or the material successes. Instead, it's a friend's trust, the remembrance of a father, the unconditional love of a mother, the joy of a team, and the purity of the game I love. My life is on a napkin, but the napkin is filled with friends, family, and warm memories. I am truly happy with my life. How lucky is that? And may we all be able to say that at the end of our lives.
Thank you, that's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.